Good morning and welcome to this week's Mindful Mornings with Dr. Matt. Today we have special guest Nira Goyal. Nira is an incoming first-year student at the University of Pennsylvania. She's an advocate of increased awareness around mental and emotional health. Seeing mental health issues in her personal extended family and in fellow peers, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, motivated her to start Teen Mental Reset Incorporated to spread knowledge surrounding mental health problems that teens face and the proper resources available for teens through community activities and educational outreach. Nira has worked with organizations such as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the YMCA, the Boy and Girls Club, and the South Florida Behavioral Health Network. In the future, she hopes to become a psychiatrist in order to help patients with their mental health issues in a clinical setting. And Nira, as we were talking about before we started the recording here for this podcast, I've been especially impressed with the work that you've been doing. You've been doing this for quite some time. And a couple of years ago, I remember being honored that you had reached out to me in terms of putting together a video for your high school. It mostly went well, except at the time I had a newborn infant who was kind of distracting us in the background. So I'm hopeful, knock on wood, none of that happens here today. And she's 3 years old. So hopefully we don't run into any of those issues. But since then, your work has truly been impeccable with everything that you're doing, both personally as well as what you're offering to the field. So Nira, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It was a long week as I was in New Hampshire doing a clinical residency for master's students at Southern New Hampshire University. But with that, it was extremely fulfilling. They were really great in terms of the clinical demonstrations. The groups went very well. And I think that they really found their footing and are feeling prepared for the upcoming field experience. And things are going well on your end. Congratulations for making it into the University of Pennsylvania. And I know you had a lot of other things going on in terms of AP tests and the like. So fingers crossed that everything went very well with those, and hopefully you get to enjoy some of this summer here. So I'm wondering, beyond the bio that I just read, why don't you share a little bit about yourself with our listeners and viewers?
Yes, of course. So, yeah, I'm going to be an incoming freshman at the University of Pennsylvania, and I hope to be a pre-med, so I can hopefully help people in the clinical setting as well. In addition to that, some of my hobbies include doing crossword puzzles, even though that's not exactly the normal thing teenagers do, hanging out with my friends, watching movies, and hanging out with my family, especially this summer before I go off to college. So I'm really excited about that. And I also love doing research. That's another thing I'm really passionate about and that I've done for the past many years through the science fair, and I hope to keep doing in college. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Well, and you truly are a go-getter. I have to tell you, when you mentioned research, how many counseling students shudder at the thought of it. And I have to remind my classes again and again, remember that counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, we are social scientists. That means that we have to do the research because research informs our evidence base upon which everything else is built. So I think that you already have a huge leg up in terms of being one who's interested in the research. And I admire everything else you're doing too, even those crossword puzzles, although maybe not the most typical thing for, adolescents, young adults to be doing here, as we know, keeps the mind sharp. We need that mental acuity and it'll help you, especially as you proceed through school, right?
Yes, definitely.
Well, tell me a little bit about what you're doing with your organization here. For the past couple of years here, I've seen a lot of great things coming out of Teen Mental Reset Incorporated. And to be honest with you, what really caught my attention is that this is relatively unique as compared to anything else I've seen. When I was in high school, middle school, we had peer mediators, talked a little bit about counseling, but it was more so framed in the area of mediation, or maybe you had your AP psychology class, but really beyond that, I haven't seen too much. So I'd love to hear a bit more.
Yes, definitely. So like you said, like there aren't as many resources available in high schools or middle schools nowadays. Like I know for myself, like it was really just like the AP psychology class I took as a freshman, and that was about it. So what I wanted to do with this organization is really focus on that educational outreach and making sure that teenagers were aware of like what are the signs of mental illness, what resources are out there for them to reach out to, and what are the different avenues they can take, because I think it's so important for teenagers just to be able to be aware of that. So that was why I mainly focused on social media outreach, because so many teenagers are on social media nowadays. So I figured that would be an effective way of getting information out. So I focus on mainly putting out like infographics or videos going over important topics surrounding mental health, especially among teenagers throughout my organization. And I also do different in-person events as well. For instance, I've done a few different community panels throughout my organization where I've interviewed psychologists, psychiatrists, and other mental health professionals to ask them about their opinions regarding what teenagers should do to maintain their mental health and how they can reach out to a trusted adult if they face any mental health issues. And I've also worked with other teenagers throughout my organization. For instance, I was able to work with the YMCA at their Changemakers Summit and hold 2 workshops where we went over the stress teens are facing and what teenagers can do to cope with that stress in the midst of college applications, extracurriculars, keeping up with homework, and all that. So that was really fulfilling as well. And I really enjoyed doing that. And I'm also hoping to keep that going in the future with different educational outreach events and things like that. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I do both in person and online through my organization.
Well, it's a little bit shared, but you're truly doing so much and really thinking about it in terms of that advocacy piece, reaching out to community, spreading awareness. I mean, this is something that even many, professionals aren't even doing and have very little time to extend to. So when we talk about the stigma around mental health, addictive disorders, and otherwise, we really need to get the conversation going. And I believe that the earlier we do that, the better, because think about how many adults who are out there who, still have that stigma around mental health. They're uncomfortable speaking about it to other people. They're extremely uncomfortable taking that look from within. Now, if we have that consideration for adults in general, really we need to consider what this looks like for our youth, because in this capacity, these individuals may not have the tools for introspection, are unaware of the different resources that are out there, especially may struggle starting the conversation. I found that that was one of the things that was very problematic. So for example, when it comes to suicide, and as we see, suicide rates have really increased over the past several years, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the big pieces of misinformation that's out there is that speaking about suicide will lead to somebody taking their lives. So for example, you have a friend in high school shares with you, Nira, I'm thinking of ending my life, but don't tell anybody about it. And then for many students, the knee-jerk reaction is to keep it secret. Don't tell anybody, out of fear that if I share with with my friends, parents or caregivers, if I share with the school counselor, a teacher, or somebody else, that my friend is now going to take their own life. But the reality is that having the conversation doesn't lead to a healthy person taking their life. If anything, what it does is it provides some protective factors, some opportunities to be able to step in, intervene, and help the individual get to a better place. I'm wondering, do you see a lot of that?
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of stigma that unfortunately exists around mental illness. And it's important that we try to remove that because, like you said, like it's important that we not only focus on adults, but also teenagers when it comes to that, which is why I think it's so important to start those conversations around mental health from a young age, like starting in high schools and with other peers and things like that. And I recently did like a teen mental health first aid course. So that example you gave was actually really interesting because they talked about how like not talk bringing up suicide, believing that that would protect someone is actually one of like the most common myths out there, and that it's more important to talk to someone about it and then recommend they go seek help from a trusted adult. So I really think it's important for information like that to be shared with other teenagers because teenagers are much more likely to reach out to their peers rather than an adult. So it's important that those teenagers know what to do when that happens, which is why I think education is such an important part of this and advocacy and breaking that stigma around mental illness. That way people feel comfortable having that conversation, which is why I think education plays such a big role in that, especially for teenagers, because if they know that mental health is just as important as physical health and that what these different disorders are and what the signs are. I think that's so important in order to deconstruct that stigma and make sure that teenagers are more willing to speak out about that and also help their peers if the situation arises and get them that help and get them to that trusted adult, which is why I think that's so important that we make sure to deconstruct that stigma and make sure it doesn't exist in society anymore, because mental health is just as important, if not more important, than physical health.
Well said, Nira. Spoken like a true professional. I mean, so on, being completely honest with you, and it's so impressive that you already have this awareness. All I can do is anticipate you having a very bright future in touching many lives, although I know that you already have to this point. Now, I'm wondering in terms of a general question, and from your perspective, so what you noticed, throughout your experience here, what do you think really does lead to that stigma? Like, why are high schoolers having such a hard time talking about these pressing, extremely important topics?
Yeah, so I definitely think some of that stigma stems from the past, because like in the past, people with mental health disorders have been portrayed as like crazy or violent, which isn't true. So I think that that past preconception, as it kind of trickles through society, contributes to the stigma that currently exists. And also like portrayals in the media of different people with mental health disorders, or even in like popular movies, like people may not think about it, but like people with mental health disorders can often be portrayed as like kind of being insane or crazy. And even that like vernacular that's used nowadays is kind of contributing to the stigma. So I think there's all these different social things that contribute to it. And also, again, that like lack of willingness to speak about it, I think is also contributing to the stigma that currently exists, which is why I think it's important to have organizations out there like the National Alliance on Mental Illness and others that are out there doing good work, kind of spreading awareness around mental illness and trying to break down that stigma so people see that like people with mental health disorders aren't crazy or unreasonable, and they make sure that that stigma doesn't exist anymore so people feel more comfortable getting help. So I definitely think that there's been progress made in breaking down the stigma around mental illness, but we definitely still have like a long way to go.
Completely agree with you. And, that is one of the things with the stigma, too. It's something that's highly personal. When somebody is struggling with a mental health addictive disorder, otherwise, a lot of individuals, defense mechanisms come in. We're trying to protect ourselves. Maybe it's a point of internalized shame and feeling as though I'm less than, there's something wrong with me, rather than recognizing what's truly going on over there. And we really need to open up that conversation, to have this discussion here, because otherwise, many people are going to continue struggling, and they're going to continue doing so on their own. So we need to have more of these platforms here. So, another thing too to think about is, how do we really continue to get the ball rolling here, so to speak? So you put together an amazing platform, and you're doing the outreach, you're advocating, but certainly, this is something that we would want to see replicated elsewhere. So what are some general considerations for those who are listening to this, to maybe start their own group and do something similar to what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think one of the considerations is maybe reaching out to schools, especially if you're trying to reach out to youth, because schools can be a great way to do that. Like, I know myself, like, I started a mental health club at my high school in order to hopefully make sure that more teenagers at my high school were aware of the information that I was sharing through my nonprofit. So that way I could also incorporate that into the school environment, or even like working with a community center to organize a panel. For instance, like, I reached out to my local library to do that. Like, I think reaching out to local organizations to work with them on what's already there and making sure you're reaching youth that way is really important. Like those grassroots organizations, like I know the Boys and Girls Club has a lot of chapters in a lot of different areas, and so does the YMCA. So reaching out to them to ask about if you can do something like host a panel, or maybe just host an event with like your friends or something like that to talk about it, I think is really important. And I also think that just making sure you're aware of like what mental health is exactly and how you can maintain your own mental health is really important. Just the way like you can have those conversations with your peers yourself, because it doesn't necessarily have to be like you form an organization. It can just be something you change on how you interact with your peers and friends in your daily life, like asking them how they're doing and making sure you take note of any changes in their behavior and how they're acting, or maybe how they're behaving with you. I think that's really important as well, just to make sure that people are aware of that just in their own lives on a day-to-day basis. But there's definitely other community organizations that are out there for people to reach out to in order to replicate this, because like you said, I think it's really important to have this effort built on and making sure that people are doing it in so many different places where it's needed. And I think that grassroots effort and reaching out in your own community is definitely like the place to start and one of the most important ways of doing it, to making sure you're helping out your fellow peers and neighbors and friends.
This is awesome. You touch upon some important points. Yeah, I'm really impressed with everything you're having to say here. And part of what you said too is being well balanced yourself. And I think it's, again, another myth that for mental health professionals or those who are trying to advocate that everything is going perfect in their lives. Remember, progress over perfection. There's no such thing as perfection. All of us have different life challenges that we're trying to navigate as we're moving forward. But the important part is being balanced, being resilient, utilizing your coping skills, having the self awareness, reaching out to others as needed. And when you're doing this type of work, it's important that you do serve as a role model of wellness, because when you do that, other people are watching. In a professional capacity, clients are watching. People who are watching my presentations are paying very close attention. And so, in that respect, we really do lead by example. So, that's going to be an important part of this. But you don't need to have everything perfectly together to be able to do this type of work. What was really smart here as well is that what you're sharing is that you're working smarter, not harder. And I think this is where a lot really gets lost in terms of the advocacy efforts. Individuals will try building something all the way up from scratch. Let me try to put this big group together. Let me hope that people show up to this. But in reality, there are so many different organizations out there doing amazing work, such as the Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCA, NAMI, and other community organizations, where you can reach out to whoever the leader, the facilitator is of that group, share your idea, perhaps get permission to be able to host an event on site in collaboration with them, and then have them help you reach out to their body of membership, so that they can come ahead and be able to participate in that. And that's something that's really helpful. And while you might get some pushback, maybe some organizations won't be as interested in this as other ones. I mean, that's certainly part of it. The realistic truth is that really the worst that places are going to say is, well, no, unfortunately, we don't have the time. This isn't necessarily the best fit. But by starting with those organizations, you can really move forward and do a lot.
Yes, definitely.
Well, I'm wondering, in terms of different things that you're seeing, what are some of the most common challenges that you saw in your high school as you were going through over the past several years?
Yes. So as far as like some of the most common challenges, like I definitely think the number one for teens is stress, just because in this day and age, there's so many different stressors that are present for teenagers. You have social media, you have extracurriculars, homework, college applications, sports, like whatever is going on in someone else's life, they all can kind of become stressors for teenagers. And this is kind of like on top of just growing up and like figuring out who you are, like those things that like teenagers and youth are going through. And like to add on to that, like we also had that like unique challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic, which kind of like interfered with like how we grew up and like interacted with our peers because we were kind of socially isolated overnight. So I think all of that kind of like adds to the stress that teenagers are facing. So I think that's definitely one of the challenges out there, is like, how do you handle that stress and like how do you talk to someone about that stress? So I definitely think it's important to kind of let teens know like ways to kind of deal with that stress, whether that be like exercising or taking out time for yourself, or just like making sure you're getting enough sleep, which I know like so many teenagers struggle with. And then there's also, of course, like that talk that needs to be had about social media and like how to use it in positive ways, not necessarily just stop using it altogether, but just making sure that you're using it in a way that's good for your own mental health. So I definitely think stress is one of the challenges that teenagers are facing nowadays. And I think other than that, it's kind of just getting that education about mental health and mental illness and making sure that teenagers are aware of the resources that are out there so they don't feel that they're alone, because there's so many resources out there like the 988 number and that hotline and NAMI and so many others that are out there, or even just talking to your like school counselor or your parents. Like I think it's important that teenagers know the resources that are out there. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of education or talk about that right now. So I definitely think that's another challenge that teenagers face. And kind of going off of the anxiety, I think another thing that teenagers face is just like kind of figuring out like time management and like how to making sure they're not like overburdening themselves or saying yes to everything when they could probably say no to a few things. And I think that kind of all contributes to it and makes sure that teenagers kind of know how to schedule themselves. So I definitely think those are some of the challenges that teenagers face nowadays.
Ah, yes. And remember, when you say yes to one thing, you're oftentimes saying no to another, which is usually time for self-care with loved ones and so on. So setting the boundaries is extremely important. And when it comes to stress, the important lesson here is that it's all relative. A
Yeah.
stressor is literally anything. When we're alive, your heart is beating, even while you're asleep at rest, you are under stress. So one of the things that we have to think about is it really comes down to one's perception of the stressor, and this is contributed by one's genetic predisposition, lived experiences, what they've been taught, whether or not they're resilient, they have coping skills, and so on. And I think this is where many adults truly do miss the mark, is that we minimize the experiences that are had
Hmm.
by our youth because, well, it's really not that big of a deal. I mean, it's just a homework assignment. It's not like you missed the work deadline or going to get fired. Well, when this is
Hmm.
a lived experience our youth have had, and this is something especially important to them, it is going to be extremely stressful, and especially
Hmm.
taking a look. I know one thing, a lot of parents, caregivers give their youth a hard time about relationships. You're in a
Yeah.
relationship for a month. It feels like, this is the best thing that's ever happened. You're going to move forward. You're going to get married. You're going to have kids, go the whole 9 yards. You break up, and it's the most devastating thing you've ever experienced. And then we have adults trying to give the support. Oh, there's other fish in the sea. It's not that big of a deal. It's just a 1 month relationship. But to that adolescent, it is that big of a deal. And we really need to come from that perspective to be as supportive as possible. And this means that we have to hear our youth out, listen to what you're saying, accept what you're saying at face value, and provide the appropriate level of support that is desired or necessary, to that individual to be mostly effective. And when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to keep in mind that throughout this time, beyond the educational component, yes, you're developing educationally, but there's also the physical component, there's a social component, and so much more that's going on. So a lot of our youth did have the proverbial rug ripped out from beneath their feet when the pandemic hit. Now having social distancing restrictions, being unable to participate in various types of clubs, missing various social events, being fearful of the future, what's going to happen. There's a lot of unknown out there. And this truly was something that was unprecedented. And I have to say that, the effects are still lingering. It's not like it just went away once everything opened back up. People are still impacted
Yes.
by this. So we need to be mindful of these experiences as we move forward. So having that awareness is ever so important.
Yes, definitely.
What I'm wondering, so what are your intentions for moving forward? What are you hopeful for your organization, perhaps for you personally? Where are we going?
Yes, so definitely. Like in the future, I definitely hope to keep going with the educational outreach aspect of my nonprofit, like posting on social media and making those videos. And I hope to keep interviewing wonderful mental health professionals that are out there and making sure to get their opinion on so many different topics that are relevant to teenagers and adults surrounding mental health. So I definitely hope to keep participating in that aspect of it. And in the future, I also hope to keep doing more in-person events and working with more organizations. Like in the Philadelphia area, when I get there, I'd love to be able to reach out to different local organizations there and work with them to have more community panels and other events like working with teenagers and educating them around mental health. So I'd love to be able to do that. And like even at the college where I'm going, University of Pennsylvania, I'd love to be able to host events there with my nonprofit for students, like for perhaps something just to like relieve stress, like something not very stressful and just kind of chill, or doing something like that, or like even doing something where I have an expert come in and to talk to students and tell them about mental health and different things they can deal with. Like I know college students deal with like homesickness and like getting adjusted to the new environment. So even doing something like that would be really cool as well. So I hope to continue to grow my nonprofit and make sure that I'm doing more events and reaching out to more areas, especially since I'll be going to a new area soon. So I think that'll be a really exciting opportunity full of different things that I could do with my nonprofit. So those are some of my plans for the future.
At this point here, I think growth is inevitable. Again, you're making all the right moves, and you certainly are off to a great start with what you've got here. And something else that you touched upon, I'm going to tie it into what we were discussing earlier. You were talking about, continuing to do the outreach and really trying to normalize the experience, having presentations that are more general in fashion, not scary and intimidating. And again, oftentimes when people think about mental health, they go to the worst case scenario. They're thinking of antisocial, criminal type of behavior, psychotic breaks, and so on. But the truth is that many people experience varied levels of challenges as they're going forward. And when we want to present this to the general public, individuals who don't have the background education on mental health, we want to ensure that we relate it in a way that can be easily understood. It's something relatable, it's meaningful, we have the resources. And again, truly demonstrating that, although it is, the research states about 40% of individuals globally, experience a diagnosable condition at one point in life, the reality is that all of us, it's inevitable, will face some type of hardship that could truly be better handled with the additional support. And when it comes to
Yeah.
really taking a look at the face of mental illness or the face of addiction, one of the things I think is important to consider here is that for many individuals, they look just like anybody else who's happy, healthy, functioning. Remember, not too long ago, I think it was a few months ago at this point, I was doing a podcast on addiction. And I was asked the question, well, what does somebody who's actively using look like in presentation when you're meeting them in a session? I was like, well, if it's somebody who's struggling with a more moderate to severe addiction, when they're actively using, they probably look normal. I really, when I don't see it, is when they're craving or when they're going through withdrawal. But when individuals get to that point where they're using just to function, they're going to look as normal as anybody else. It's when they're not using or we start to see more of those problems. Or even take a look at general mental health, major depressive disorder. Robin Williams is a really great example. Might be wearing a smile on your face, but the reality is individuals may feel as though they're dying inside. And from my personal experience too, gone through some hard times, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. We were just talking about, I'm very extroverted, felt like an extrovert put into an introverted shell, had a lot of loss around me. And although my productivity for work was going up, I was continuing to advocate, I was wearing a smile, cracking jokes, and so on. I was really struggling internally. And when I would vocalize that to other people, so many shut me down. Well, Matt, you're the mental health guy. You're smiling. You're giving great recommendations. That doesn't mean that I'm not struggling. And that's something that we really need to be mindful of. Again, take at face value what people are sharing with you. And especially when it comes to our youth, because they need us to be able to stand up for and support them. And just, you're really hitting the right notes with everything that you've got here.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Like, it's important to know how to have those conversations with youth and like other adults to kind of like get to the root of what's happening. Like, even if someone like maybe like seems like they're fine, like it's important to be able to find out like how they're really doing. So yeah, I totally agree.
Absolutely. Well, I'm wondering on your end, is there anything additional that anybody could be doing to support your initiative? So, if you have some type of outreach, what could we do to further support your work?
Yeah, I definitely love if people could visit my website. It's teenmentalreset.org, or you can find me on like LinkedIn or also Instagram and TikTok at Teen Mental Reset. So just like viewing those videos or perhaps like following on Instagram or TikTok and liking them is always like really helpful for me. Or even donating, which you can do through my website, like anything helps. And that's always really helpful for me. So that way I can keep hopefully doing more in-person events and doing more outreach on social media. All of that is really helpful. And of course, if anyone ever wants to reach out to me with any questions or anything they recommend, you can always email me. There's an option to do that on the website. So yeah, all of that really helps, and I really appreciate it all.
Well, excellent. And that did encapsulate one of my final questions in terms of the best way to be able to contact you. So I'm glad we have that information. As I know, I'm trying to be mindful of time. I know you've got other things to be doing here today, too. I'm wondering, are there any key takeaways, final messages that you would like to share with those who are listening to this podcast?
Yes, definitely. I think one of the key takeaways is the importance of education in all of this and just making sure that you yourself are aware of what the signs of mental illness are and just some ways to maintain your own mental health on a daily basis. So, like, if you want to find out more about that, I definitely recommend going to websites like the National Alliance on Mental Illness or like the American Psychological Association. They have a lot of great information around that. And if you yourself want to ever reach out to anyone or need resources, I think it's important for people to be aware of like the 988 hotline and other resources out there. So yeah, those are my key takeaways from today.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you very much. And remember, the bottom line is that each of us knows ourselves best. We are the expert on our own lives, our lived experiences, if you will. And if something doesn't feel right, that is the time to speak up. Do so sooner than later, because again, mental health disorders are oftentimes pervasive, meaning that if you don't intervene in some type of way, they'll likely get worse over time. And also, in trying to be an ally, supporting loved ones, if anything seems off base, remember it's important to start the conversation. Now, we want to be affirming. We don't want to go on the attack or anything where we're alienating the person who we're really trying to support. But start the conversation. Remember, asking the question, starting the conversation is not going to lead to an otherwise healthy person harming self or others, acquiring a
Mhm.
mental health disorder or otherwise. We need to continue destigmatizing mental health and addictive disorders. But Nira, it's been truly a pleasure having you as a guest on this podcast. Thank you for everything that you've been doing. I look forward to continuing to support you, and anything that you need in the future, please do feel free to reach out. Okay.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And those at the University of Pennsylvania and otherwise are truly privileged to have you be a part of that work. Thank you for all that you're doing. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.